Hey there, welcome back. Before we dive in, take a deep breath and let the stress of the day melt away. I'm really glad you're here, and I'd love to get to know you better. So if you had to choose, what would be your favourite food? Let me know in the comments. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And enjoy. The oscilloscope's amber screen flickered in the dim garage light, casting ghostly shadows across Noah Cross's angular face. At 17, he possessed the kind of restless intelligence that made teachers uncomfortable and classmates distant. While other kids his age were planning prom or worrying about college applications, Noah spent his nights elbow deep in salvaged electronics, surrounded by the metallic bones of decommissioned military equipment he'd rescued from scrapyards across New Mexico. His mother's Honda pulled into the driveway with its familiar wheeze, signalling the end of another 12-hour shift at Presbyterian Hospital. Sarah Cross emerged looking exhausted, her scrubs wrinkled and her auburn hair escaping its ponytail. She paused at the garage entrance, watching her son's silhouette hunched over his latest project. "You're going to electrocute yourself one of these days," she said, though her voice carried more resignation than real concern. She'd given up trying to drag him away from his experiments years ago. "I'm being careful, Mum." Noah didn't look up from the oscilloscope's guts, where he was methodically replacing burnt capacitors with modern equivalents. "This baby's from 1962, military grade. They don't make them like this anymore." Sarah shook her head and disappeared into the house. Noah had always been different, reading quantum mechanics textbooks at 12, building radio receivers from spare parts at 14. The other military brats at school called him weird, but Noah preferred the company of electrons and magnetic fields to teenage drama anyway. The oscilloscope had been his best find yet, pulled from a pile of junk at Sanchez Salvage outside Santa Fe. The old man behind the counter had barely glanced at it when Noah offered $20, muttering something about old DARPA crap under his breath. What Sanchez didn't know, what Noah didn't know either, was that this particular piece of equipment had once been part of something called Project Kronos, a classified quantum resonance experiment that had been hastily shuttered in 1963 after producing results that terrified even its creators. For 3 weeks, Noah had been rebuilding the machine's internal architecture, integrating it with his custom-built Tesla coil and a high-frequency generator he'd assembled from marine radio parts. The fusion of 1960s military precision with modern amateur engineering created something that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, pregnant with the kind of electrical violence that New Mexico summers delivered with biblical fury. Noah glanced at his phone. 11:47 p.m. Perfect timing. He needed the atmospheric disturbance to test his theory about electromagnetic resonance patterns. As if summoned by his thoughts, the first crack of thunder split the night. Lightning strobed through the garage windows, and Noah felt the familiar electric tingle that preceded a major storm. He flipped the power switch on his jury-rigged apparatus, watching voltage readings climb on the digital multimeter he'd wired into the system. The oscilloscope screen came alive with dancing waveforms, complex interference patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Noah fine-tuned the frequency generator, chasing a harmonic sweet spot he'd calculated but never achieved. The Tesla coil hummed with increasing intensity, its copper windings glowing faintly in the darkness. Then he heard it, a voice emerging from the static of his old radio, words bleeding through from some distant transmission. "Eagle Squadron reporting heavy resistance over Hamburg. Repeat, heavy resistance." The voice carried the crisp, urgent tone of a military radio operator, but the accent was wrong, the phrasing too formal for modern communications. Noah frowned, adjusting the radio's frequency dial. The voice strengthened. "Coordinates confirmed. Proceed to target Alpha 7. Static swallowed the transmission, then spit out fragments. "God help us all." Lightning struck somewhere close, the thunder arriving almost instantaneously. In that same moment, Noah's equipment reached critical resonance. The oscilloscope screen exploded with impossible geometries, waveforms that seemed to fold in on themselves like origami made of pure energy. The Tesla coil's hum became a scream, and the air itself began to taste metallic. What happened next defied every law of physics that Noah understood. The space around the oscilloscope began to warp, reality bending like heated glass. A darkness opened in the centre of the distortion, not the mere absence of light, but something that hurt to look at directly, a tiny wound in the fabric of space-time itself. Noah reached for the power switch, but the magnetic field had become so intense that his tools were flying toward the anomaly like iron filings toward a magnet. The radio's static crescendoed into a banshee wail, and that impossible voice from the past shouted clearly through the chaos. "Trinity test confirmed! The gadget works! God forgive us!" The garage tilted, or maybe Noah tilted. The world became a kaleidoscope of spinning tools and sparking electronics, and then the darkness swallowed everything with the sound of reality tearing like wet fabric. Consciousness returned in pieces, the taste of copper pennies, the smell of sage and dust, the sensation of grit against his cheek. Noah opened his eyes to find himself face down in a red desert sand, his body aching as if he'd been thrown from a moving car. The familiar weight of his smartphone pressed against his thigh, and his garage-stained t-shirt and jeans felt alien against the profound silence of the wilderness. He pushed himself upright, squinting against sunlight that seemed wrong somehow, too yellow, too clean. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant mesas and the occasional scrub brush. There was no sign of his garage, his house, or even the storm that had been raging moments before. Panic clawed at his chest as he checked his phone. No signal. The date read July 15th, but the year displayed as 1943. Noah stared at the screen, certain it was malfunctioning, until he noticed something else. The device's GPS showed his location as approximately 30 miles northwest of a place called Los Alamos, New Mexico. The name triggered something in his memory, a fragment from the history books he'd devoured during his obsession with Cold War technology. Los Alamos, 1943, the Manhattan Project, the secret city where America built the atomic bomb. A dust cloud on the horizon resolved into a military jeep, its olive-drab paint job and angular design distinctly different from modern vehicles. Noah stood frozen as the vehicle approached, his mind racing through possible explanations that didn't involve time travel. Because time travel was impossible, wasn't it? The jeep screeched to a halt 50 yards away, and two soldiers emerged with their rifles raised. Their uniforms were museum pieces, wool garrison caps, canvas gaiters, and the kind of equipment pouches that belonged in old war movies. But the weapons they carried were real enough, and the suspicion in their eyes was contemporary to any era. "Halt! Identify yourself." The taller soldier's voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth despite his authoritative tone. Noah raised his hands, his engineer's mind cataloguing details even through his terror. The soldiers' uniforms bore insignia he recognised from historical documentaries, the distinctive patch of the Manhattan Engineer District. The younger soldier couldn't have been more than 19, his face sunburned and serious beneath his cap. I'm Noah Cross," he managed, his voice hoarse from breathing desert dust. "I think I'm lost." The soldiers exchanged glances. The older one, a sergeant by his stripes, stepped closer while keeping his rifle trained on Noah's chest. "Lost?" He looked pointedly at Noah's modern clothing, the synthetic fabric and machine-stitched seams that wouldn't be invented for decades. "Son, you're about as lost as a person can get. This is a restricted military zone." They searched him with professional efficiency, confiscating his phone. What the hell is this thing? His wallet, and the small multi-tool he always carried. Noah's driver's license sparked particular interest. The laminated plastic, the holographic security features, and the issuing date of 2024 caused confused murmurs between the soldiers. The ride to the military checkpoint passed in surreal silence. Noah squeezed between two armed guards in the back of the jeep. The landscape looked familiar, yet alien. The same red rocks and endless sky he'd known all his life, but somehow cleaner, emptier, as if the world were holding its breath. The checkpoint itself was a collection of temporary buildings surrounded by barbed wire and serious-looking sentries. Noah was processed with military efficiency, fingerprinted, photographed, and subjected to an interrogation that began politely, but grew increasingly intense as his story proved impossible to verify. "Let me get this straight," said Lieutenant Morrison, the intelligence officer who'd taken over the questioning. He was young for his rank, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested too many hours spent indoors with classified documents. You claim to be from Albuquerque, but we can't verify your address. Your identification card is made from materials we've never seen, issued by a department that doesn't exist, and you were found wandering in a restricted area with no memory of how you got there. Noah stuck to the story he'd hastily constructed. Amnesia from a car accident, possible head trauma, confusion about dates and locations. It was thin, but anything approaching the truth would have them convinced he was either insane or an enemy agent. The thing is, Morrison continued, leaning back in his metal chair, we've been having some unusual reports lately. Strange lights in the sky, electromagnetic disturbances. Some of the eggheads think the Germans might be testing some new kind of weapon, makes us jumpy about unexplained visitors. Before Noah could respond, the interrogation room door opened, and a man in civilian clothes entered. He was perhaps 40, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of intense, analytical gaze that Noah recognised in fellow science enthusiasts. The man glanced at Noah's file, then studied Noah himself with unconcealed curiosity. Dr. Walter Irwin, the man introduced himself, extending a hand that Noah shook automatically. I'm one of the physicists working on the project here. Lieutenant Morrison thought I might want to speak with you. Dr. Irwin settled into a chair across from Noah, his manner more collegial than interrogative. I've been reading your statements. You mentioned being interested in electronics, electromagnetic theory. Tell me, what do you know about quantum mechanics? The question was clearly a test, but Noah couldn't help himself. Despite the impossible circumstances, the prospect of discussing physics with a real scientist was irresistible. Well, I've read about wave-particle duality, quantum superposition, the uncertainty principle, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Einstein's objections to quantum entanglement. Dr. Irwin's eyebrows rose with each reference. In 1943, quantum mechanics was still cutting-edge science, discussed mainly in academic circles and classified research programs. For a teenager, especially one found wandering in the desert, to speak so knowledgeably about such advanced concepts was unprecedented. Fascinating, Dr. Irwin murmured. And what's your opinion on the practical applications of quantum theory? Theoretical, of course. Noah felt like a student stumbling through an exam he hadn't studied for, except the subject matter was the fundamental nature of reality itself. I think we're only beginning to understand the implications. Quantum tunneling, for instance, or the possibility that observation affects reality at the subatomic level. It could revolutionize everything from computing to energy production. The room fell silent. Dr. Irwin and Lieutenant Morrison exchanged a look that Noah couldn't interpret, but he sensed he'd said something significant, possibly dangerously so. Mr. Cross, Dr. Irwin said finally, I'm going to make a recommendation that might sound unusual. We have a shortage of qualified personnel here, particularly bright young minds who understand advanced physics. If you're willing, I'd like to offer you a position as a junior research assistant. It would solve your immediate problem of having nowhere to go, and it would allow us to keep an eye on you while we verify your background. Noah's heart hammered against his ribs. A position at Los Alamos in 1943 meant working on the Manhattan Project, helping to build the weapons that would end World War II and usher in the atomic age. The moral implications were staggering, but what choice did he have? Refusing would only deepen their suspicions, and he needed time to figure out how to return to his own era. I'd be honoured to help however I can, he said, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. The temporary quarters they assigned him were Spartan but comfortable. A narrow bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out over the sprawling complex of laboratories and living spaces that made up the secret city. Noah lay awake that first night, staring at stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than the ones he remembered, wondering if he was going insane or if he'd somehow stumbled into the greatest scientific adventure in human history. His first day of work began before dawn with a security briefing that emphasized the absolute necessity of discretion. The project was compartmentalized, with each worker knowing only what they needed to complete their specific tasks. Noah was assigned to the electronics division, where his job involved calibrating sensitive measuring instruments and maintaining the complex array of equipment needed for the scientists' experiments. The work was fascinating despite his limited access to information. He found himself surrounded by technology that was advanced for 1943, but primitive by the standards of his own time. Vacuum tube computers the size of refrigerators, mechanical calculators that clicked and whirred through complex equations, and electromagnetic devices that seemed to bend the laws of physics through brute force rather than elegant engineering. It was during his second week that he first encountered Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer himself. The scientific director of the project was younger than Noah had expected from photographs, but he possessed an intensity that made the air around him seem to vibrate with barely contained energy. Oppenheimer moved through the laboratories like a force of nature, discussing quantum theory in one breath and Sanskrit poetry in the next. "You're the young man Walter's been telling me about," Oppenheimer said when Dr. Irwin introduced them. His pale blue eyes seemed to look straight through Noah, as if he could read the secrets written on his soul, the one with the interesting perspectives on electromagnetic theory. Noah mumbled something appropriately modest while trying not to stare at the man who would become known as the father of the atomic bomb. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but it left him shaken. This wasn't history anymore. These were real people making real decisions that would reshape the world. The moral weight of his situation hit him fully during a conversation with Eva Stein, a young woman who worked as a laboratory assistant in the chemistry division. She was perhaps 22, with dark hair pinned back severely and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. Eva had fled Nazi Germany in 1938, leaving behind family members who had since disappeared into the horror of the Holocaust. "They have my parents," she told Noah one evening as they shared coffee in the mess hall. "My younger brother too. The letters stopped coming last year." Her voice was steady, but Noah could see the carefully controlled grief in the set of her shoulders. "Every day I work here, I tell myself that what we're building will end this war faster, maybe save people like them." Noah wanted to tell her the truth, that her family was likely already dead, that the bombs they were building would kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, that the war would end in August, but the nuclear age would bring its own terrors. Instead, he listened and nodded, and felt the weight of forbidden knowledge settle on his chest like a stone. Eva was too observant for her own good. Within a few weeks, she began asking pointed questions about Noah's background, his education, his mysterious appearance in the desert. She noticed inconsistencies in his story, anachronisms in his speech, and the way he sometimes seemed to know things he shouldn't. "You're not who you say you are," she confronted him one evening as they walked between the laboratory buildings. The New Mexico sky blazed with stars unmarked by light pollution, and the air carried the scent of sage and the faint ozone smell of high-voltage experiments. "Your accent isn't quite right for New Mexico. Your clothes, when they brought you in, the fabric was like nothing I've seen. And yesterday, when Dr. Fermi was discussing neutron bombardment, you started to say something about enrichment cascades before you caught yourself." Noah's blood turned to ice water. Uranium enrichment cascades were a theoretical concept in 1943, not yet implemented in the massive facilities at Oak Ridge. His knowledge of the process came from textbooks written decades in the future. "I don't know what you mean," he said, but Eva stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "I think you do. The question is whether you're a German spy with access to intelligence we don't know about, or something else entirely." She paused, then added quietly, "There's something about you that doesn't fit in this time." The phrase hit Noah like a physical blow. He stopped walking, staring at her in the starlight. "This time?" Eva's expression softened slightly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about people who slipped between moments, who fell through cracks in the world. I always thought they were just stories." She reached out and touched his arm gently. "But then I met you. Standing there in the desert night, surrounded by the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century, working to unlock the secrets of the atom, Noah made a decision that would change everything." He told Eva the truth. Not all of it at first. Just fragments, pieces of an impossible story about oscilloscopes and time rifts, and accidentally discovering that the boundaries between past and future were more fragile than anyone imagined. Eva listened without interruption, her scientist mind analysing and cataloguing, even as her human heart struggled to accept what she was hearing. "Show me," she said finally. "If what you're saying is true, show me proof." Noah led her to his quarters and retrieved the items the security personnel had returned to him: his wallet, his phone, his multi-tool. Under the light of a table lamp, Eva examined each object with forensic attention. The synthetic materials, the manufacturing precision. the electronic components that wouldn't be invented for decades. All of it pointed to a technology base far beyond 1943. When Noah powered on his phone and showed her the stored photographs from his own time, images of modern Albuquerque, of the Los Alamos National Laboratory as it would exist in the 21st century, Eva's scientific skepticism finally crumbled. "Mein Gott," she whispered, scrolling through pictures of a world she would never live to see. "It's real. You're really from... When did you say... Ixas Onesibse?" "I didn't plan this," Noah said urgently. "I was just experimenting with electromagnetic resonance, and something went wrong. I need to get back, but I need equipment I can't access, and knowledge I'm not supposed to have." Eva was quiet for a long time, studying his face in the lamplight. Finally she asked, "In your time, do we win the war?" "Yes, but the cost." Noah struggled with how much to reveal. "The bombs we're building here, they work. They end the war in August 1945, but they also kill hundreds of thousands of people in Japan, and they start an arms race that brings the world to the brink of destruction multiple times. And if we don't build them, I don't know, maybe Germany develops them first. Maybe the war drags on for years longer, and millions more die in conventional fighting. History is complicated." Eva nodded slowly. "Then we continue the work. But we also get you home." She looked at him with new determination. "What do you need?" The answer was both simple and impossibly complex. Noah needed to recreate the conditions that had brought him to 1943, the specific electromagnetic resonance frequency, the quantum interference pattern, and most critically, a massive energy source to power the dimensional rift. The problem was that 2 of those 3 requirements involved classified materials and equipment that were under constant guard. For 2 weeks they planned in whispered conversations and stolen moments between work shifts. Eva used her access to the chemistry labs to identify potential sources of the materials they needed, while Noah designed modifications to existing equipment that might generate the necessary quantum field resonance. Their planning was complicated by the growing suspicions of Frank Kessler, a junior physicist whose professional jealousy had been kindled by Noah's rapid integration into the project. Kessler had noticed the attention Dr. Irwin paid to Noah's insights, the way senior scientists sometimes paused to listen when Noah offered suggestions. More dangerously, he'd begun asking questions about Noah's background and qualifications. "There's something off about that kid," Kessler complained to anyone who would listen. "He shows up out of nowhere with no verifiable credentials, and suddenly he's offering advice to Oppenheimer himself. Mark my words, he's not what he seems." The situation came to a head on the evening of July 14th, just as Noah and Eva were preparing to attempt their escape. Kessler had spent weeks gathering what he considered evidence of Noah's suspicious nature, his mysterious arrival, his advanced knowledge, the inconsistencies in his personal history. That night, he presented his findings to Army intelligence. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Security personnel searched Noah's quarters, analysed his possessions, and subjected him to intense questioning that grew more hostile by the hour. The phone, with its impossible technology, was all the proof they needed that Noah was hiding something significant. "Son," said Colonel Patterson, the security chief who'd taken over the case, "I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this." He held up Noah's smartphone, its sleek design and advanced materials utterly alien in the 1940s environment. "This device contains technology that's decades ahead of anything we've developed. The only question is whether you're working for the Germans, the Russians, or someone else entirely." Noah tried to maintain his cover story, but it was collapsing under the weight of physical evidence and mounting suspicion. They knew he wasn't who he claimed to be. The only question was what they would do about it. The answer came at dawn on July 15th, when Colonel Patterson informed him that he was being transferred to a more secure facility for enhanced interrogation. The implication was clear. They would use whatever methods necessary to extract the truth from him, and given the stakes of the Manhattan Project, those methods would not be gentle. It was Eva who provided the solution. Using her security clearance and knowledge of the facility's layout, she created a diversion that would give them one chance to escape, but only if they acted during the Trinity test itself, when attention would be focused on the world's first atomic bomb detonation. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. The Trinity test was scheduled for 5:30 a.m. on July 16th, just hours away. The massive electrical systems used to trigger the bomb's detonation would create electromagnetic interference across the entire region, perfect cover for the kind of quantum resonance experiment they needed to perform. Eva had managed to smuggle key components from various laboratories, high-voltage capacitors, resonance coils, and most crucially, a small sample of enriched uranium that would provide the quantum instability necessary to punch through the dimensional barrier. They would use the high-voltage testing chamber in Lab 7, timing their experiment to coincide with the Trinity detonation. "If your theory is correct," Eva said as they made final preparations in the pre-dawn darkness, "the atomic blast will provide enough energy to reopen the temporal rift. But Noah," she paused, her hand on his arm, "if you're wrong, we'll both be vaporized along with everything else in this desert." Noah looked at her in the dim light, this remarkable woman who had risked everything to help him return to a future she would never see. "Come with me," he said impulsively. "I don't know if it's possible, but—" Eva shook her head. "This is my time. My war. I have work to finish here." She pressed something into his hands, a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. "But perhaps something of me can make the journey with you." They entered Lab 7 through a service tunnel that Eva had scouted weeks earlier, emerging into the high-voltage testing chamber where massive electrical equipment hummed with barely contained power. Noah worked with desperate efficiency, connecting his improvised quantum resonance device to the lab's electrical systems while Eva monitored for security patrols. Outside, the pre-dawn sky was beginning to lighten. In a bunker 20 miles away, scientists and military personnel were making final preparations to witness humanity's first glimpse of atomic fire. Noah's hand shook as he made the final connections, knowing that in a few minutes the course of human history would change forever. At 5:29 a.m., alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Someone had discovered their absence, and security teams were sweeping the complex. Eva barricaded the laboratory door while Noah powered up his equipment, watching voltage readings climb toward the critical threshold. 30 seconds to Trinity, Eva reported, monitoring a radio she'd brought to track the countdown. "Noah, whatever happens, I want you to know—" Her words were cut off by the sound of soldiers shouting outside the laboratory. Security personnel had found them. 10 seconds, Noah whispered, his hand hovering over the activation switch. Through the laboratory's small window he could see the distant Jornada del Muerto desert where history was about to be made. The world went white. For an instant that lasted eternity, Noah experienced the birth of the atomic age as pure energy. The Trinity bomb's detonation 20 miles away registered as a pressure wave that seemed to compress time itself, while his quantum resonance device screamed to life in sympathetic response. Reality folded inward like origami made of light and impossible mathematics. He felt Eva's hand in his as the dimensional rift opened. Not the tiny wound in space-time that had brought him to 1943, but a vast tunnel of swirling energy that stretched between moments. The laboratory around them dissolved into constituent atoms, then reformed as something else entirely. The transition felt like drowning in reverse, a sensation of being pulled up through layers of compressed time until he burst through the surface of the present, gasping and disoriented. Noah found himself lying on the concrete floor of his garage, surrounded by the familiar clutter of his electronics workshop. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, but wrong in subtle ways that made his skin crawl. The oscilloscope that had started his journey sat on the workbench, but now it bore the faint inscription JRO 1943 etched into its metal housing. His radio, previously tuned to a local rock station, was picking up what sounded like a big band number from the 1940s. Noah staggered to his feet, his mind reeling from the transition. Outside, dawn was breaking over familiar mountains, but the light seemed different, cleaner somehow, as if the world had been subtly retuned while he was away. He stumbled into the house, finding his mother already gone for her morning shift at the hospital. It wasn't until he walked to school that the changes became apparent. The building was the same, but the name carved into the stone facade now read Eva Stein Memorial High School. Inside, a bronze plaque near the main office commemorated an anonymous contributor to the Manhattan Project, whose sacrifice advanced the cause of freedom. Noah stood before the plaque for a long time, reading and rereading the dedication that mentioned a young German refugee who had died in a laboratory accident during the final days of the war. The official story was sanitized, bureaucratic, but Noah could read between the lines. Eva had stayed behind, continuing her work on the project that would end the war and reshape the world. The final confirmation came when he arrived home that afternoon to find a package waiting on his doorstep. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was Eva's grandmother's locket, the same one she had pressed into his hands moments before their escape attempt. A note written in Eva's careful handwriting accompanied it. "My dear Noah, if you're reading this, then you made it back safely, and time has found a way to complete our circle. I wanted you to know that I survived the laboratory accident that the official reports describe, though I was never able to explain the miraculous escape that saved my life. I went on to work on peaceful applications of atomic energy, always remembering the young man from the future who showed me that science must be tempered with wisdom. The locket has waited 60 years to find you again. Perhaps now you understand that some journeys through time are meant to bring us home to who we were always supposed to become." E.S. 1983. Noah clutched the locket, feeling the weight of decades and the warmth of a friendship that had transcended time itself. He had returned to his own era, but the experience had changed him in ways he was still discovering. The burden of knowledge he carried, about the future consequences of the atomic age, about the moral complexities of scientific progress, would shape every decision he made going forward. That evening, he stood in his garage workshop, staring at the oscilloscope that had started his incredible journey. The machine hummed quietly, its screens dark and peaceful. Noah reached for the power switch, then stopped. The temptation to experiment further, to explore other moments in history, was almost overwhelming. Instead, he walked outside into the New Mexico night. Rain was falling, gentle and warm, and in the distance lightning played across the mountains where Los Alamos National Laboratory continued its work into the 21st century. Noah tilted his face to the sky, feeling the electric potential in the air, and made his choice. Some doors, once opened, should remain closed. Some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue, no matter how alluring the mysteries it might reveal. He had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of time itself, had walked among the giants who shaped the modern world, and had learned that the past was both more fragile and more resilient than he had ever imagined. The locket around his neck caught the light from a distant street lamp, a silver reminder that some connections transcend the boundaries of space and time. Eva Stein had chosen to stay in her moment of history, to face the consequences of the atomic age with courage and wisdom. Now it was Noah's turn to find his place in the world, armed with the knowledge that the future was not fixed, that individual choices mattered, and that the responsibility to use knowledge wisely was the greatest burden and privilege that any scientist could bear. As he stood there in the rain, watching lightning dance across the sky, Noah Cross understood that his real journey was just beginning. The boy who had accidentally torn a hole in time had returned as a young man who understood the weight of temporal responsibility. Whatever came next, he would face it with the wisdom Eva had given him, and the understanding that some adventures were meant to change not the world, but the adventurer himself. The oscilloscope in his garage would remain forever silent, its quantum secrets locked away. But the echo of his journey through time would ripple forward through every choice he made, every life he touched, and every moment when he chose wisdom over knowledge and responsibility over power. In the end, that was the most profound discovery of all, that the greatest experiments were not with the fabric of space-time, but with the limitless potential of the human spirit to grow, to learn, and to become something greater than what it was before. The aurora blazed across the Los Angeles sky like digital fire, streaks of green and violet that shouldn't have existed this far south. Ethan Reyes adjusted his jury-rigged VR headset one more time, the solar panels he'd grafted onto its sides catching the last rays of October sunlight filtering through the eucalyptus trees of Griffith Park. His phone was propped against a rock, live streaming to maybe 12 people who cared about his quantum gaming revolution project. "Okay, chat, we're about to push this thing to 11, he said, voice crackling with nervous energy. Solar batteries at 96%, geomagnetic readings are off the charts, and he squinted at his smartwatch. Holy shit, the magnetometer's going crazy. This storm's hitting harder than predicted. The headset's weight felt familiar on his skull, cables snaking down to the makeshift battery pack at his waist. Months of salvaged electronics, YouTube tutorials, and stubborn determination had led to this moment. While his classmates were grinding through senior year applications, Ethan was trying to crack the code of consciousness itself, or at least build something cool enough to go viral. Initiating full-spectrum neural mapping in 3, 2... The world exploded into kaleidoscopic fragments. Colours that had no names shrieked across his vision as every nerve ending caught fire. The aurora above seemed to reach down with crackling fingers, and Ethan felt himself falling through dimensions of light and time, his scream lost in a cosmic wind that tasted of ozone and eternity, then darkness, then cold, then the gentle slap of waves against his face. Ethan's eyes fluttered open to find himself sprawled on wet sand beneath a canopy of unfamiliar stars. The aurora was gone, replaced by a moon so bright it cast sharp shadows across pristine beach. His VR headset lay in pieces nearby, circuits still sparking feebly. The air smelled of salt and rotting seaweed, but underneath that was something else, an absence of the petroleum and exhaust that always lingered in LA's atmosphere. His smartwatch face was cracked but still functional, showing 11:47 p.m. The date read October 15th, but the year display flickered between 2020 and something impossible, 1716. What the actual... Well, what have we here? Ethan jerked upright to find 3 men standing over him, their silhouettes outlined against the star-drunk sky. Tricorn hats, loose-fitting shirts, and the unmistakable glint of cutlass steel. His brain, still reeling from whatever had happened, tried to process this information and failed spectacularly. "Looks like a survivor from that sloop we spotted breaking up on the reef," said one of them, his voice carrying a strange accent. Part English, part something Caribbean. Fancy clothes, though, silk by the feel of it. Another man, broader and more scarred, spat into the sand near Ethan's feet. Could be Spanish, could be valuable, could be trouble. Only one way to find out. The third man, younger than the others, extended a hand. "On your feet, lad. Captain'll want words with you." Ethan's hand moved instinctively to his phone, but found only empty pocket. He looked around frantically until he spotted it half buried in sand, its cracked screen dark. When he reached for it, the youngest pirate, because these were definitely pirates, his mind finally admitted, grabbed his wrist. "Careful now. What's this curious thing?" The man lifted the phone, turning it over in his hands. "Some manner of spyglass? The craftsmanship is peculiar. It's, Ethan's voice cracked. "It's a navigation device. Very advanced. Very expensive." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "You speak strangely, boy. Where are you from?" Before Ethan could concoct an answer, torchlight flickered through the palm trees behind them. More voices, more footsteps. The beach suddenly felt very small and very exposed. "Silas, Tomas, what's the delay?" The voice that cut through the night air belonged to a woman, commanding and sharp. "The tide turns in an hour, and I'll not have the stormcrow caught in these shallows because you 3 decided to play with beach refuse." The woman who emerged from the tree line stood barely 5.5 feet tall, but carried herself like she owned every grain of sand beneath her boots. Dark hair was braided with bits of bone and coloured thread, and her coat, a deep blue thing that might once have belonged to a naval officer, hung open to reveal a brace of pistols across her chest. Most striking were her eyes, pale green and sharp enough to cut glass. "Captain Vane," said the youngest pirate, Thomas. "Found this one washed up with wreckage from that Dutch sloop. Claims his bauble here is some sort of navigation aid." Captain Vane's gaze moved from Ethan's face to his clothes, the synthetic fibres of his gaming hoodie, the complex weave of his jeans, the rubber soles of his sneakers. Her expression shifted from annoyance to curiosity. "Navigation, you say?" She plucked the phone from Tomas's grip and examined it more closely. The glass is remarkably clear. The craftsmanship ... She looked up at Ethan. "What's your name, boy?" "Ethan? Ethan Reyes. Spanish blood then. But your accent." She circled him slowly, predator-like. "Where did you learn to speak English so cleanly? And where did you acquire clothes of such unusual make?" Ethan's mind raced. He'd read enough fantasy novels to know that claiming to be from the future was a quick path to accusations of madness or sorcery. Neither seemed like good career moves when surrounded by armed pirates. "I'm a scholar," he said carefully, "from a distant university. I was aboard a research vessel studying celestial navigation when the storm hit." "A scholar." Captain Vane's smile was sharp. How fortunate. The Stormcrow has need of men with learning. She turned to the scarred pirate. Silas, what think you? Silas spat again. I think he's too clean to have been in any shipwreck, and his kit's too fine for any honest scholar. Could be a spy, could be bait. Either way, he's trouble we don't need. Perhaps he's exactly what fate has provided. Vane handed the phone back to Ethan. Tell me, scholar, can you read the stars? Ethan glanced up at the alien constellations above them. But they weren't alien, he realised. They were simply the same stars he'd known all his life, viewed from a different latitude and without the light pollution of modern civilization. The Big Dipper hung low on the horizon, and Polaris glittered like a diamond in the north. Yes, he said, I can read them. And can you chart a course by them? This was dangerous territory. Ethan knew the basics of celestial navigation from astronomy classes and Wikipedia binges, but theory and practice were very different things. Still, it seemed like his best chance of not ending up as shark food. With the proper instruments, yes. Captain Vane studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, Ethan Reyes. You'll come aboard the Stormcrow as our navigator, prove useful, and you'll earn your share like any other member of my crew. Prove otherwise. She let the implication hang in the salt air. What if I refuse? Then Silas gets his wish, and you remain here on this beach. Permanently. Her hand rested casually on the butt of one pistol. The choice is yours, scholar. Ethan looked around at the empty beach, then at the dense jungle beyond. He had no idea where he was, when he was, or how he'd gotten here. But these people had a ship, which meant they had food, water, and most importantly, mobility. His best chance of figuring out what had happened and how to get home lay with them. I accept. The Stormcrow proved to be a sleek brigantine anchored in a sheltered cove, her twin masts rising like spears against the starfield. As the longboat approached her hull, Ethan could make out carved decorations along her rails and the gleam of bronze cannons in her ports. She was beautiful in the way that all dangerous things were beautiful. Elegant, deadly, and utterly unforgiving of mistakes. The next weeks passed in a blur of rope burns, seasickness, and hard-won education in the realities of 18th century piracy. Thomas, despite being only 11 years old, proved an invaluable guide to shipboard life. The boy had grown up on these decks after being orphaned in Port Royal, and his quick wit and street-smart humour made him Ethan's first real friend among the crew. Keep your head down, speak when spoken to, and never show fear, Thomas whispered, as he taught Ethan to tie proper knots. Captain Vane's fair but hard. She'll give you every chance to prove yourself, but cross her or show cowardice, and you'll find yourself swimming home. Dr. Adelina Montserrat, the ship's surgeon, presented a different challenge. A woman in her late 20s with intelligent dark eyes and steady hands, she watched Ethan with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Her medical knowledge was impressive for the era, but when Ethan carelessly mentioned the concept of antiseptics during a conversation about treating wounds, her interest became almost predatory. You speak of invisible creatures that cause infection, she said one evening as she tended to a sailor's infected cut. This is not theory I have encountered in any medical text. It's a new idea, from the universities in the north. Ethan watched as she cleaned the wound with rum, wincing at the waste of good alcohol. Have you ever noticed that wounds heal better when cleaned with spirits, rather than water alone? I have observed this, yes, but you suggest there is a reason beyond the spirit's heat. What if I told you that bread mould, when properly prepared, could fight infection more effectively than any spirit? Adelina's eyebrows rose. I would say you're either a genius or a madman, possibly both. It was during their third week at sea that Ethan's modern knowledge proved its worth in dramatic fashion. He was on night watch, using his smartwatch's digital compass and star chart app, carefully hidden from view to verify their position, when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The constellation of Cassiopeia hung too low on the horizon. Combined with the Southern Cross's position, it meant they were sailing directly toward a reef system that wasn't marked on any of their charts. "Captain!" Ethan's shout brought Vane running from her cabin, half-dressed and fully armed. "Hard to starboard. There's a reef directly ahead." "I see no reef," Silas growled from the helm. "The water's deep here, boy. Check your instruments." "Trust me." Ethan pointed at the subtle change in wave patterns barely visible in the moonlight. "The waves are breaking differently. There's something large and shallow about 200 yards ahead." Captain Vane studied the water for a heartbeat, then bellowed, All hands, hard to starboard. Drop anchor when I give the word. The Stormcrow heeled over as her crew threw their weight into the turn. 30 seconds later, the lookout's cry confirmed Ethan's warning. Reef to port. Damn near took her belly out. That night, as the crew celebrated their narrow escape with an extra ration of rum, Captain Vane approached Ethan at the bow rail. "Your eyes are sharper than any man's I've known," she said quietly, "and your knowledge of star paths runs deeper than most. Tell me true, what are you running from, Ethan Reyes? Why do you assume I'm running from something? Because men don't join pirate crews out of wanderlust. They join because the life they left behind offers them nothing, or because staying would mean death." Her pale eyes reflected starlight. "Which is it for you?" Ethan considered telling her the truth. The whole impossible truth. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he said, "I'm looking for something. Something I lost." "What manner of thing?" "The way home." Vane nodded slowly. "Aye, that's something we're all seeking one way or another." She turned to go, then paused. "The crew respects you now. You've earned that. Don't squander it." Their first raid came 2 days later, when they intercepted a Dutch merchant vessel heavy with sugar and silver from the Caribbean colonies. Ethan had hoped to avoid the violence, to somehow remain a non-combatant, but Captain Vane made it clear that every member of her crew fought when fighting was required. "A ship is only as strong as her weakest link," she told him, as the crew prepared for battle. "If you won't fight beside us, you're not one of us. And if you're not one of us..." The boarding action was brief and brutal. Ethan found himself swept along by the tide of screaming pirates, cutlass in hand, too terrified to do anything but swing when someone swung at him. The Dutch crew surrendered quickly, but not before Ethan had seen men die, really die, with blood and screams and the terrible finality of stopped hearts. In the aftermath, as the crew divided the spoils, Ethan made a discovery that changed everything. In the merchant captain's cabin, hidden beneath a false bottom in a chest of navigation instruments, he found half of something that made his smartwatch's sensors go haywire. It was jade, carved in intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the lamplight. Metallic veins ran through the stone. Magnetite, he realised, remembering his physics classes. When he held it close to his watch, the device's magnetic field sensors spiked, and for just a moment, the cracked screen flickered with readings that defied logic. "Temporal displacement detected," scrolled across the display before it went dark again. "Quantum signature match, 94%. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. This thing, whatever it was connected to what had happened to him. Connected to the Aurora, to the impossible rift that had torn him from 2020 and dumped him in 1716. "Ah, you've found my little treasure." Ethan spun to find Captain Vane watching from the cabin doorway, her expression unreadable. "This is yours?" "Now it is. Took it from a Spanish treasure ship 3 months past, along with the other half." She produced a matching piece of jade from beneath her coat. The Spanish captain said it was an Aztec artifact, combined with Chinese astronomical knowledge, called it the Jade Astrolabe. When the two halves were brought together, they formed a perfect sphere covered in intricate carvings. Symbols that looked like star maps mixed with mathematical formulas, and threading through it all were those metallic veins that made Ethan's watch go berserk. "There was writing with it," Vane continued, "a prophecy of sorts. When the starborn child comes to mend the sky at Dragon Gate, twin suns shall writhe and heaven's door shall open." Poetic nonsense, I thought. But now... She looked at Ethan meaningfully. "Now I wonder..." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion on deck. Silas burst into the cabin, his scarred face twisted with anger. "Captain, we have a problem. That merchant vessel we took, she was flying Dutch colours, but her papers mark her as English. We've just robbed a ship under Crown protection." Vane's jaw tightened. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough. And certain that Commodore Nathaniel Hawke of His Majesty's Navy will be hunting us within the week. He's been stalking these waters for months, looking for any excuse to put a noose around your neck." The name seemed to hit Captain Vane like a physical blow. Her hand went instinctively to a scar along her collarbone, and her eyes hardened. "Hawke," she whispered, "then we run. Set course for Tortuga. We need information, supplies, and a place to lay low while we plan our next move." Tortuga proved to be everything Ethan had imagined and worse. The infamous pirate haven was a sprawling collection of ramshackle buildings, taverns that never closed, and people who asked no questions as long as your silver was good. The air reeked of unwashed bodies, cheap rum and moral decay. It was there, in a tavern called the Laughing Skull, that they met the cartographer who would change everything. He was an ancient man, skin like leather and eyes clouded with cataracts, but his hands were steady as he examined the jade astrolabe by flickering candlelight. I know this device, he wheezed. Seen its like once before in the hands of a Chinese explorer who claimed it could open doors between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. He traced the carved symbols with one gnarled finger. But this one's different, more complex. The star patterns... He looked up sharply at Ethan. You understand astronomy, young man? Some. Then you'll know these aren't random decorations. They're a star map, showing the positions of celestial bodies during events of great magnetic disturbance. Solar storms, they call them in the Chinese texts, when the sun's fire reaches out to touch the earth. Ethan's pulse quickened. And Dragon Gate? The old man's smile was gap-toothed and knowing. A place where the earth's magnetic field runs strange, where compasses spin like dancers and the northern lights sometimes touch the water. The Spanish call it El Triángulo del Diablo. Your people might know it by another name. The Bermuda Triangle. Ethan's blood turned to ice water. He was talking about the Bermuda Triangle, that legendary region where ships and planes disappeared without trace. And if the prophecy was right, if the astrolabe could somehow open heaven's door during a solar storm... How far to Dragon Gate? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. 3 days hard sailing to the northeast, but you'll not want to go there, lad. Ships that enter those waters during the aurora storms, they don't come back. That night, as the crew slept off their shore leave, Ethan found Captain Vane standing at the Stormcrow's bow rail, staring out at the star-drunk Caribbean sky. You're planning to sail for Dragon Gate, he said. It wasn't a question. Aye. The prophecy speaks of a star-born child who will mend the sky. You arrive from nowhere, speaking strangely, dressed in clothes no tailor on earth has made, carrying devices that confound our understanding. She turned to face him. Tell me true, Ethan Reyes. Are you that child? Ethan looked into her pale green eyes and made a decision that would doom them all. Yes, he said. I am. The next morning brought news that chilled everyone's blood. Thomas had gone ashore the previous evening and failed to return. Search parties found him in the custody of local authorities, arrested for brawling with British sailors. But the circumstances were suspicious. Witnesses claimed the British had started the fight, and that Thomas had been targeted specifically. It's a trap, Silas growled as they gathered in Vane's cabin to plan a rescue. Hawke's here, or his agents are. They're using the boy as bait. Then we give them what they expect, Vane replied. We walk into their trap, but we do it on our terms. The rescue mission that followed became the stuff of legend among the Tortuga taverns. Ethan, driven by guilt and desperate to save his young friend, proposed a plan that seemed insane, but just might work. Using his knowledge of chemistry and the ship's store of gunpowder, he improvised a series of flashbang explosives that would disorient their enemies long enough for a swift extraction. The plan worked perfectly until it didn't. They freed Thomas and were fighting their way back to the harbour when British Marines appeared from concealment, cutting off their escape route. In the running battle that followed, Ethan found himself fighting alongside Captain Vane, his modern reflexes and unpredictable tactics proving surprisingly effective against trained military opponents. It was during that fight that he saw her true nature for the first time. Arabella Vane wasn't just a pirate captain, she was a force of nature, moving through combat with lethal grace, every shot perfectly placed, every sword stroke economical and deadly. But there was something else in her eyes as she fought, something that looked almost like joy. They made it back to the Stormcrow and escaped into open water, but not before Ethan caught a glimpse of their pursuer. Commodore Nathaniel Hawke stood on the dock watching their departure, and even at a distance Ethan could see the cold intelligence in the man's pale eyes. This was no ordinary naval officer. This was a hunter who had found his prey. "He'll follow us," Vane said as Tortuga fell behind them. "Hawke's lost too much to pirates to let us slip away again. He'll dog our wake until one of us is dead." "What did you take from him?" Ethan asked. Vane's hand went to her collarbone scar again. His brother, 3 years ago, off the coast of Jamaica. Young Lieutenant Hawke, fresh from England and full of righteous fire. He died with a sword in his hand and my blade in his heart. That night, as they sailed toward the mysterious waters of Dragon Gate, Ethan told Captain Vane the truth. All of it. The time travel, the quantum rift, his desperate need to return to 2020. He expected disbelief, mockery, perhaps accusations of madness. Instead, she listened in thoughtful silence, occasionally asking technical questions that demonstrated a sharp understanding of both navigation and natural philosophy. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "The aurora that night you arrived," she said finally. "I've sailed these waters for 10 years, and I've never seen lights like that so far south. And your devices, your knowledge of star paths we've never charted." She nodded slowly. I believe you. The question now is what we do with this knowledge. We use the astrolabe. We wait for another solar storm and we open the rift. And then I go home. Ethan met her eyes. And you become legend. The next 2 days passed in a strange atmosphere of anticipation and dread. The crew sensed that something momentous was approaching, but only a handful knew the full truth. Dr. Montserrat had been brought into their confidence, and her scientific mind had seized on the implications with fierce enthusiasm. "If what you describe is true," she told Ethan, as they prepared the astrolabe, "then we are about to witness the greatest natural phenomenon in human history. The practical applications alone." Her eyes shone with possibilities. The medical knowledge you've shared, the concept of bacterial infection, the potential of bread mold as an antiseptic. This could save thousands of lives. "We'll save thousands of lives," Ethan corrected, "in about 300 years. They reached Dragon Gate on the morning of the 3rd day, sailing into waters that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. Compasses began spinning wildly, and several crew members reported feeling strange tingles in their extremities. Ethan's smartwatch, which had been mostly dormant since his arrival, suddenly blazed to life with readings that defied explanation. "Magnetic anomaly detected," scrolled across its cracked screen. "Temporal field fluctuation imminent. Quantum cascade event probable." "How long?" Captain Vane asked, reading over his shoulder. "Soon. The solar storm's building. Look at the horizon." To the north, the sky was beginning to take on an unnatural hue, green and violet threads dancing between the clouds. Aurora Borealis, impossibly far south, painting the Caribbean sky with colours that belonged to the Arctic. It was then that Commodore Hawke's frigate appeared on the southern horizon, her white sails cutting through the afternoon heat like knife blades. But she wasn't alone. Another ship sailed alongside her, flying familiar colours. "Christ's blood," Silas breathed. "That's the Storm Crow." He was right. Impossibly, there were now 2 Storm Crows sailing these waters, the one they stood on, and another approaching from the south under the guns of Hawke's frigate. "Temporal echo," Ethan whispered. "The rift's already beginning to form. We're seeing ourselves from another timeline, another possibility." But even as he spoke, he realised the truth was worse than that. The second Storm Crow flew different colours, not the black flag of piracy, but the red banner of mutiny. Silas had finally made his move, seizing control of the ship and delivering it to Hawke in exchange for a royal pardon. "All hands, prepare for battle!" Vane's voice carried across the deck like a clarion call. "Mr. Crow has shown his true colours at last, but will not go gentle into that good night." The battle that followed defied every convention of naval warfare. 3 ships manoeuvred through waters that seemed to twist space itself, while overhead the aurora grew stronger, casting eerie light across the scene. Ethan climbed the mainmast with the jade astrolabe, trying to align its intricate mechanisms with the growing magnetic storm above. Cannon fire thundered across the water as the 2 Storm Crows engaged each other in a battle that was both real and impossible. Ethan could see Silas on the deck of the other ship, bellowing orders to crew members who should have been standing right beside him. The paradox was tearing reality apart at the seams. "Now, Ethan," Captain Vane's voice cut through the chaos. "Whatever you're going to do, do it now." Above them, the aurora had become a writhing mass of energy that seemed to reach down toward the sea. Lightning crackled between the masts of all 3 ships, and the water itself began to glow with phosphorescent fire. Ethan pressed the 2 halves of the astrolabe together and felt power surge through the device like a living thing. The jade sphere began to spin in his hands, its carved symbols blazing with inner light. The metallic veins that ran through it sparked and danced, and suddenly the air around him tore open like fabric. Through the rift, Ethan could see Griffith Park in 2020. His own world, his own time, calling to him across centuries. The portal pulsed with every heartbeat, and he knew that if he was going to go, it had to be now. But as he prepared to leap through, he looked down at the deck of the Stormcrow and saw his friends fighting for their lives. Thomas, barely 11 years old, standing back to back with Dr. Montserrat as they faced Hawke's Marines. Captain Vane, blood streaming from a wound on her forehead, still fighting with the fury of a hurricane given human form. He could save himself. He could go home. All he had to do was jump. Instead, Ethan Reyes made the decision that would echo through legend for centuries to come. He twisted the astrolabe's mechanisms, not to stabilise the portal, but to redirect its energy. The rift that had opened to 2020 collapsed, but in its place, new doorways tore open across the battlefield. Commodore Hawke's frigate, caught in the dimensional crossfire, vanished into a swirling vortex that deposited it in the middle of the Sahara Desert, circa 1543. The mutinous Stormcrow, along with Silas and his treacherous crew, fell through a rift that led to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, but in the year 2157. The energy backlash sent Ethan tumbling from the mast into the churning waters below. As he fell, he felt Captain Vane's ring, a simple band of gold set with a single emerald, pressed into his palm. "Remember us," her voice followed him into the dark water. "Remember that we were here." The last thing Ethan saw before the portal collapsed was Arabella Vane standing at the rail of the Stormcrow, her pale green eyes bright with tears and laughter, watching him disappear into the space between moments. He woke up in Griffith Park, lying in a crater of scorched earth, with his ruined VR headset still smoking beside him. The aurora was fading from the sky, and his phone, miraculously intact, showed 11:48 p.m, October 15th, 2020. Only 1 minute had passed since the accident, but in his hand he held Captain Vane's ring, and embedded in the VR headset circuitry was a fragment of jade that pulsed with inner light. Over the following weeks, Ethan threw himself into research with the desperate intensity of a man trying to prove he wasn't insane. He studied astrophysics, quantum mechanics and temporal theory, looking for any scientific explanation for what had happened to him. The jade fragment resisted all attempts at analysis, but his smartwatch had recorded enough data to suggest that his impossible journey had actually occurred. The final proof came 2 months later, when he was visiting the Natural History Museum downtown. In a new exhibit on colonial Caribbean artefacts, he found a display case containing a gold ring set with an emerald dated to approximately 1720. The placard read, "Ring of Unknown Origin, discovered in the personal effects of the notorious pirate captain known as Grim, Arabella Vane." According to contemporary accounts, Captain Vane claimed the ring was a gift from a starborn navigator who saved her crew from destruction. Historians consider this claim to be typical pirate folklore, though the ring's provenance remains mysterious. Ethan stared at the display for a long time, remembering pale green eyes and the sound of his name called across 3 centuries. Then he walked out of the museum and into his future, carrying the weight of legend and the knowledge that somewhere in the past his friends were still sailing toward their destiny. In his apartment that night, as he worked on new equations that might someday allow him to control temporal rifts, instead of simply stumbling through them, Ethan Reyes smiled and thought he heard the distant sound of wind in rigging and waves against a ship's hull. Somewhere in 1720, Captain Arabella Vane stood at the bow of the Stormcrow and watched the aurora dance across the Caribbean sky, remembering a strange young man who had taught her crew that legends were just truth waiting to be discovered. The morning mist clung to the Virginia hills like the breath of ghosts, and 17-year-old Elias Rowe moved through it with the practiced silence of someone who had learned early that making noise brought unwanted tension. His boots, worn thin at the soles and patched with scraps of leather, made barely a whisper against the dew-soaked earth as he slipped away from the ramshackle farmhouse, where his uncle Jeremiah still lay sleeping off another night's worth of corn whiskey. Elias had been orphaned at 12 when fever took both his parents within a week of each other, leaving him with nothing but a few books, his father's old surveying tools, and the dubious mercy of his father's younger brother. Jeremiah Rowe was a hard man made harder by drink and failure, his small farm perpetually on the edge of ruin, his temper as unpredictable as summer storms. The boy had learned to make himself scarce during the worst of it, disappearing into the dense forest that surrounded their property with an ease that would have impressed even the Cherokee who had once called this land home. Today, like so many others, Elias sought refuge in exploration. He carried with him a leather satchel containing his father's compass, a few pieces of jerky wrapped in cloth, a small journal bound in cracked leather, and his most prized possession, a collection of sketches and notes about the native peoples who had once lived in these mountains. His father had been fascinated by their culture, their connection to the land, and had filled Elias's childhood with stories of their ceremonies, their wisdom, and their mysterious disappearance from the region. The forest called to him with promises of discovery. Every hollow might conceal arrowheads, every outcropping of rock might reveal petroglyphs, every cave might hold secrets from the people who had vanished like morning mist before the advancing tide of European settlement. Elias had already found several sites, a circle of stones that might have been a ceremonial ring, scattered pottery shards that he carefully catalogued and sketched, and most recently stories from old-timers in the nearer settlement about a cave deep in Raven's Hollow that the Cherokee had considered sacred, or perhaps cursed. The locals called it the Whispering Cave, claiming that strange sounds emerged from its depths during storms, that animals avoided it, and that more than one hunter had emerged from its vicinity speaking of visions and dreams that felt more real than waking life. Such tales only fueled Elias's curiosity. He had spent weeks preparing for this expedition, studying his father's survey maps, gathering supplies, and waiting for the right opportunity to slip away unnoticed. The path to Raven's Hollow was treacherous, winding through dense undergrowth and over rocky terrain that had likely remained unchanged since the last ice age. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even at midday the forest floor remained dim and mysterious. Elias moved with growing excitement, his senses sharp and alert to every sound, every play of light and shadow. When he finally reached the hollow, he understood immediately why the Cherokee had considered this place special. The very air seemed different here, heavier, more charged, as if the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds had worn thin. The cave entrance yawned before him like a mouth in the hillside, partially concealed by hanging moss and twisted vines that seemed to grow in patterns too deliberate to be natural. Elias lit his torch with trembling hands and stepped into the darkness. The cave was larger than he had expected, its walls smooth and curved as if shaped by water over countless centuries. His torchlight revealed strange formations in the rock, not quite natural, not quite carved, that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering flame. The deeper he went, the stronger became a peculiar sensation, as if he were walking not just through space but through time itself. The passage opened into a circular chamber that took his breath away. The walls were covered in petroglyphs more elaborate and detailed than anything he had seen in his father's books or his own explorations. Spirals and symbols, human figures and animal forms, astronomical charts and what appeared to be maps of territories that no longer existed, all carved with a precision and artistry that spoke of deep spiritual significance. But it was the far wall that truly stunned him. Embedded in the living rock so perfectly integrated that it seemed to have grown there rather than been placed, was a mirror of polished obsidian unlike anything he had ever imagined. It was roughly circular, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, its surface so perfectly smooth that it seemed to drink in his torchlight rather than reflect it. Around its perimeter, carved into the stone itself, were symbols that seemed to pulse and writhe in the dancing flame. Elias approached slowly, his scientific mind warring with a growing sense of awe and unease. The obsidian was clearly ancient, yet it showed no signs of wear or damage. Its surface was flawless, like a pool of still water turned to stone. As he drew closer, he began to make out his reflection, but it seemed strange, distorted, as if he was seeing not just himself, but multiple versions of himself layered one upon another. Thunder rumbled overhead, and Elias realized with a start that storm clouds had been gathering while he explored. The sound echoed strangely in the chamber, seeming to come from all directions at once. Lightning illuminated the cave entrance briefly, and in that instant the obsidian mirror seemed to flicker with an inner light. Driven by curiosity and the reckless courage of youth, Elias reached out to touch the mirror's surface. The moment his fingertips made contact with the obsidian, the world exploded into chaos. Light, brilliant, searing, impossible light erupted from the mirror's surface. The petroglyphs on the walls began to glow as if lit from within, their symbols writhing and dancing like living things. The thunder outside became a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, and Elias felt a sensation like falling, though his feet remained firmly planted on the cave floor. The obsidian mirror rippled like water under his touch, and suddenly he was not touching a solid surface but reaching into something vast and liquid and alive. A force beyond his understanding seized him, pulling him forward into the mirror's depths. He tried to pull back, but it was like trying to escape a river in flood. The light grew brighter, the roar louder, and then silence. Elias woke to the sound of birdsong unlike any he had ever heard. Complex, musical, hauntingly beautiful. He lay on soft earth carpeted with moss and fallen leaves, but the trees above him were different from those he knew. These were giants, old-growth forest that stretched up into a canopy so high and dense that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The air itself felt different, cleaner, wilder, charged with life and possibility. He sat up slowly, his head spinning with confusion and disorientation. His torch was gone, but he didn't need it. Streams of golden sunlight provided illumination that revealed a world transformed. The forest around him was pristine, untouched by axe or plough, teeming with life in a way that the woods of his own time never were. Massive chestnuts and oaks rose like cathedral pillars, their trunks so wide that a dozen men couldn't encircle them with joined hands. Beneath them grew an understory of species he couldn't identify, flowers in colours more vivid than any he had seen, berries that gleamed like jewels. But it was the sounds that truly convinced him something extraordinary had happened. Not just the complex bird song, but the rustle of large animals moving through the undergrowth without fear, the splash of fish jumping in a nearby stream that ran clearer than crystal, the whisper of wind through leaves that seemed to carry voices and music from another world. Elias stood on unsteady legs, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had he struck his head in the cave? Was this some vivid hallucination brought on by injury or exposure? But the sensations were too real, too complete. The scent of wild herbs and flowers, the feeling of moss beneath his feet, the play of light and shadow. Everything was more intense, more alive than his ordinary world. A rustling in the bushes nearby brought him sharply to attention. Something large was moving through the undergrowth, something that moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Elias's blood turned to ice as a massive bear emerged from the vegetation. Not the black bears he knew from his own time, but something larger and more formidable, with fur that gleamed silver-brown in the filtered sunlight, and eyes that held an intelligence both ancient and dangerous. The bear regarded him with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression, but Elias knew better than to trust such appearances. He began backing away slowly, trying to remember everything his father had taught him about wilderness survival. Don't run, don't make sudden movements, don't look directly into its eyes. But the bear continued to approach, and Elias could see the massive claws, the powerful muscles beneath the fur, the sheer size of the creature. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm him, the sharp whistle of an arrow split the air. The shaft struck the ground between Elias and the bear, and the animal looked up with what seemed like resignation rather than fear. More arrows followed, not aimed to kill, but to drive the bear away, and after a moment of tense standoff, the great creature turned and melted back into the forest with surprising grace. Elias spun around to see his rescuers emerging from the trees like spirits materializing from the green twilight. There were 5 of them, and they moved with a silence and fluidity that made his own woodland skills seem clumsy by comparison. They were Native Americans, but not like any he had seen in illustrations or descriptions. These were people of the deep forest, their clothing made from finely worked hides and decorated with intricate beadwork and painted designs. Their faces were strong and weathered, marked with tattoos and paint that seemed to tell stories he couldn't read. The leader was a man of perhaps 40 years, his long black hair bound with feathers and carved bone ornaments. His eyes were dark and penetrating, missing nothing as they studied this strange pale boy who had appeared in their territory. Behind him stood 2 younger men who might have been his sons, their hands still resting on their bows, and 2 women, one middle-aged with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, and one much younger, perhaps 16, whose gaze held a peculiar intensity as she stared at Elias. The leader spoke in a language that flowed like water over stones, musical and complex, full of nuances that Elias couldn't begin to understand. When he didn't respond, the man switched to what sounded like a different dialect, then another, his voice growing more impatient with each attempt. Finally he gestured sharply and the two younger men moved to flank Elias, their intentions clear. "Wait," Elias said, holding up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "I mean no harm. I'm lost. I don't know how I got here." The words seemed to surprise them. The older woman stepped forward and spoke rapidly to the leader, her tone urgent. The younger woman, little more than a girl really, tilted her head as if listening to something only she could hear, then spoke in the same flowing language. Whatever she said caused the others to look at Elias with new interest, their hostility giving way to something that might have been wonder. The girl approached him slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful. She was beautiful in a way that seemed to belong to this wild place. Her skin bronzed by sun and wind, her hair black as a raven's wing and decorated with small carved ornaments that caught the light, her eyes the colour of deep forest pools. When she spoke, her voice was soft but filled with certainty. "You are the one from the sky stories," she said, in accented but clear English. "The one who walks between the times." Elias stared at her in shock. Not only could she speak his language, but her words suggested knowledge of his impossible situation. "You speak English? How do you... Where am I? When am I?" The girl smiled and it transformed her face entirely. "I am a Hyoka. I learned the tongue of the Eastern peoples from traders who came when I was small. But you are not from the East. You are from the time that has not come." Before Elias could respond, the leader barked something sharp and a Hyoka stepped back, her expression becoming more formal. The older woman gestured impatiently, and the group began to move deeper into the forest, clearly expecting Elias to follow. He looked around at the pristine wilderness, at the weapons and clothing that belonged to no European culture he knew, at the faces that regarded him with mixtures of suspicion and awe, and realized he had no choice but to trust these strangers. They travelled for hours through country that grew more beautiful and wild with each mile. Elias saw animals he had never imagined, flocks of birds with feathers like living jewels, deer so numerous they moved through the forest like flowing water, streams so clear he could count the pebbles on the bottom from 20 feet away. This was North America, as it had existed before European settlement, before the Great Dying, before the forests were cleared and the buffalo slaughtered and the native peoples driven from their ancestral lands. As they walked, a Hyoka fell into step beside him, ignoring the disapproving looks from the others. She pointed out plants and animals, teaching him their names in her language, telling him stories about their spiritual significance. Her English was limited but improving with use, and Elias found himself fascinated not just by her knowledge, but by the way she saw the world. Everything connected, everything alive, everything part of a great web of relationships that extended far beyond the merely physical. "My grandmother dreams of you," she said as they paused to rest beside a spring that bubbled up from moss-covered rocks. "She says the sky people told her of one who would come when the wheel of time turns crooked, one who carries the knowledge of what will be, but has forgotten the wisdom of what is." "Sky people?" Elias asked, accepting a drink from a water skin that tasted of herbs and something indefinably wild. A Hyoka gestured toward the canopy above, where the last light of day filtered through the leaves. "The ancestors who became stars. They watch over us, guide us, sometimes send us dreams and visions. They told my grandmother that the mirrors would wake again, that someone would come through the spirit paths to help prepare for the time of great change." Mirrors? The word sent a chill through Elias as he remembered the obsidian surface, the impossible light, the sensation of falling through dimensions. "The sky mirrors," Hyoka said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "made by the first people, before the great ice, before the world changed. They are doorways between the times, but they were sealed long ago because the spirit said it was dangerous to walk between then and now and will be." As night fell, they reached the village, and Elias understood immediately that he had stepped into a world beyond his wildest imagination. The settlement was not the collection of crude huts he might have expected from his limited knowledge of Native American life, but a sophisticated community of perhaps 300 people, their dwellings arranged in careful patterns that seemed to follow the natural contours of the land. The houses themselves were marvels of engineering and artistry, some built of wood and bark in styles that varied according to family and clan, others partially dug into hillsides and covered with earth, and growing plants that made them almost invisible from a distance. Garden plots were integrated seamlessly with the natural landscape, growing not just corn and beans and squash, but dozens of other crops in carefully planned combinations that seemed to mimic the diversity of the forest itself. But it was the people who truly amazed him. These were not the savages of European imagination, but a complex society with its own philosophers and artists, its own scientists and historians, its own intricate social structures and spiritual practices. Children played games that were clearly designed to teach hunting and gathering skills, while also being genuinely fun. Adults worked with tools and techniques that showed generations of refinement and improvement. Elderly men and women sat in places of honour, their words listened to with respect and attention. The arrival of the group with their strange pale captive, for that's clearly what Elias was, despite the relatively gentle treatment, caused a stir throughout the village. People emerged from their homes to stare at him, some with curiosity, others with suspicion or even fear. He heard his presence discussed in rapid conversations he couldn't follow, saw children peering at him from behind their mothers' skirts, felt the weight of dozens of eyes studying his every movement. The leader, whom Elias learned was called Adahi, meaning lives in the woods, brought him to the centre of the village, where a large fire burned in a carefully constructed pit surrounded by carved stones. Around the fire sat the village elders, men and women whose faces bore the wisdom and weariness of many winters. They studied Elias with expressions that ranged from sceptical to hostile, and he realised his life might well depend on the next few minutes. An ancient woman, her hair white as snow and her face mapped with lines of age and experience, rose from her place by the fire. This, Ayoka whispered, was her grandmother, Galilahi, whose name meant attractive, but who was known throughout the region for her spiritual power and prophetic dreams. She approached Elias slowly, her eyes never leaving his face, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. Ayoka translated, her voice tense with nervousness. She asks if you are the one who stepped through the sky mirror, the one who comes from the time of dying to learn the time of living. Elias looked around at the circle of faces, all waiting for his answer. How could he explain what he didn't understand himself? How could he tell these people about the world he came from, a world where their descendants would be driven from their lands, their languages forbidden, their children stolen and forced into schools designed to kill the native within them? I don't know, he said finally. I was in a cave in my own time. I found a mirror made of black stone covered with symbols like those on your grandmother's medicine bag. When I touched it during a storm, everything changed. I woke up here, in your forest, in your time. As Ayoka translated, Galilahi's expression grew more intense. She asked another question, and this time Ayoka hesitated before translating. She wants to know what you have seen in your dreams since you arrived. She says the sky mirrors show truth to those who pass through them, but only in dreams and visions. Elias started to say he hadn't dreamed at all, then stopped. Now that he thought about it, he had been having strange dreams, fragments of images and sensations that felt more like memories than fantasies. Vast herds of animals stretching to the horizon, rivers that ran clean and cold from mountain to sea, forests that covered the continent from coast to coast. But also darker images, ships on the horizon, men with pale faces and strange clothes, the sound of gunfire and the smell of smoke. I've seen your world as it was, he said slowly. The great forests, the herds of buffalo, the rivers full of fish. But I've also seen darkness coming, men from across the water, bringing sickness and war and changes that will transform everything. The translation of his words caused a stir among the elders. Some looked frightened, others angry, still others thoughtful. Galilahi asked another question, and Ahyoka's face paled as she listened. She asks if you have seen the time of the great dying, when 9 of every 10 people will walk the ghost trail, when the buffalo will disappear like smoke, when the forest will be cut and the rivers poisoned. Elias felt as if a cold hand had gripped his heart. These people couldn't know about the diseases that European contact would bring, the wars of conquest, the systematic destruction of their way of life. Yet somehow this old woman was describing exactly what he knew from his history books would happen. "Yes," he whispered, "I've seen that time." Galalahi nodded as if she had expected his answer, then spoke at length to the assembled elders. The discussion that followed was intense and sometimes heated, with voices raised in argument and hands gesturing emphatically. Finally, the old shaman raised her hand for silence and pronounced what sounded like a judgment. "You will stay with us," Ayoka translated, relief evident in her voice. "You will learn our ways, share in our work, become one of the people. My grandmother says the sky spirit sent you to learn what must be preserved when the time of great change comes, but she also warns that your presence here may hasten that change, that by stepping through the sky mirror you may have weakened the barriers between the times." And so began the strangest period of Elias's life. The village accepted him with the cautious hospitality they might show to any refugee, but his obvious foreignness, his pale skin, his strange clothes, his complete ignorance of skills that every child learned, marked him as different in ways that couldn't be overcome by good intentions alone. Adahi, the man who had found him, took responsibility for his education with the grim determination of someone assigned an unpleasant but necessary task. Elias learned to make fire without flint and steel, using bow drill and tinder in ways that required patience and skill he had never developed. He learned to track animals by reading signs so subtle they seemed like magic. A bent twig here, a partial footprint there, the way birds behaved when large game had passed through their territory. Hunting was even more challenging. These people didn't simply kill animals for food, they entered into a spiritual relationship with their prey, offering prayers and tobacco, taking only what was needed, using every part of what they killed. Elias struggled not just with the technical skills of using bow and arrow, but with the entire philosophy that surrounded the act of taking life to sustain life. But it was the language that proved most difficult. What Ayoka called her tongue was actually a complex system of communication that went far beyond mere words. Tone, gesture, context, even the time of day and season could change the meaning of a simple phrase. Stories were told with layers of meaning that revealed themselves only after years of study, and the most important knowledge was often embedded in songs and ceremonies that were shared only with those who had proven their commitment to the people. Ayoka became his primary teacher and gradually his closest friend. She had a gift for languages that amazed him. Not only did she speak several native dialects and enough English to communicate with traders, but she seemed to understand the underlying structures that made language possible. She could take concepts from his world and find ways to express them in hers, building bridges between ways of thinking that seemed completely incompatible. Through her, Elias began to understand that what he had always thought of as primitive life was actually incredibly sophisticated. The village existed in perfect harmony with its environment, not through ignorance or lack of ambition, but through generations of careful observation and experimentation. They knew which plants could be harvested sustainably and which needed to be left alone, how to encourage the growth of useful species without destroying the overall ecosystem, how to live as part of the natural world rather than in opposition to it. Their spiritual life was equally complex. What European observers might have dismissed as superstition was actually a sophisticated understanding of psychology, ecology, and what could only be called physics. They knew that everything in the universe was connected, that actions in one realm affected all others, that the past, present, and future existed simultaneously in what they called the Great Circle of Time. It was this understanding that made them uniquely capable of accepting Elias's impossible story. They didn't question whether time travel was possible. Their entire worldview assumed that linear time was an illusion, that the truly real existed outside the normal flow of days and seasons. What concerned them was not how he had come to be among them, but why, and what his presence might mean for the future of their people. As autumn gave way to winter, Elias began to experience what he could only describe as visions. They came during meditation, during ceremony, sometimes even during ordinary activities like gathering firewood or helping with food preparation. He would suddenly find himself seeing through other eyes, experiencing other times, understanding connections that spanned centuries. He saw the obsidian mirrors being created by a people even more ancient than the current inhabitants of the village. They were master craftsmen who understood the properties of volcanic glass, but also shamans who could work with spiritual forces that Elias barely comprehended. The mirrors were not just doorways through time, but instruments for maintaining balance in the universe, ways of preventing the timeline from becoming too rigid or too chaotic. But something had gone wrong. The vision stories told of mirrors that had been used carelessly, of people who travelled through time for personal gain rather than spiritual necessity, of changes in the past that created ripples extending far into the future. The ancient people had finally sealed most of the mirrors, hiding them in sacred places and surrounding them with warnings and protections. The mirror Elias had found was one of the last, hidden in the cave system that the Cherokee had avoided for generations. His accidental activation had torn open a pathway that was supposed to remain closed, and every day he remained in the past increased the danger of paradox and chaos. Winter brought new challenges, but also deeper integration into the life of the village. Elias learned to appreciate the long evenings when the community gathered around fires to share stories, to work on crafts that required patience and skill, to plan for the coming year. He discovered that he had a talent for the intricate beadwork that decorated clothing and ceremonial objects, his steady hands and attention to detail making him valuable, despite his other limitations. More importantly, he began to understand the stories. What had seemed like simple folk tales when Ahyoka first translated them revealed themselves as complex repositories of scientific knowledge, historical information, and spiritual wisdom. Stories about animals contained detailed information about behaviour and ecology. Tales of heroes and spirits encoded practical instructions for everything from agriculture to astronomy. Accounts of the time before preserved memories of geological and climatological changes that stretched back thousands of years. And threaded through many of the stories were references to the sky mirrors and the people who had travelled between times. Elias realised that he was not the first person to fall through the temporal barriers. The oral traditions contained dozens of accounts of strangers who appeared mysteriously, lived among the people for a while, then disappeared just as suddenly. Some had been helpful, sharing knowledge that proved valuable. Others had been disruptive, bringing changes that upset the careful balance of tribal life. "My grandmother says you're different from the other Skywalkers," Ahyoka told him one evening, as they sat by the fire working on a winter robe decorated with astronomical symbols. "Most of them try to change things, to make our world more like theirs. But you try to change yourself, to become more like us." "Maybe that's because I don't have a world to go back to," Elias replied, surprised by the bitterness in his own voice. "My uncle doesn't care whether I live or die. I have no friends, no prospects, nothing but more of the same grinding poverty and ignorance." Ahyoka looked at him with the serious expression she wore when working through a difficult translation. "The words you use, poverty and ignorance, they don't mean what you think they mean. You come from a time of great riches, but your people are poor in spirit. You come from a time of much knowledge, but your people are ignorant of wisdom." "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the village around them, where people were going about their evening activities with quiet contentment. "Here, no one goes hungry unless everyone goes hungry. No one lacks shelter unless everyone lacks shelter. Children are raised by the whole community. Old people are honoured and cared for. Everyone has work that is valued and meaningful. In your time, you have great buildings and powerful tools, but people live alone and die alone. Many have no work or work that serves no good purpose. The weak are left to suffer while the strong take more than they need." Elias wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Everything she said was true. His own time, for all its technological advantages, was marked by inequality, loneliness, and spiritual emptiness that these primitive people had somehow avoided. As winter deepened, so did his connection to the community. He participated in ceremonies that revealed layers of meaning each time they were performed, learned songs that were also scientific treatises and historical chronicles, helped with the everyday work of maintaining life in harmony with the natural world. For the first time in his life, he felt as if he belonged somewhere, as if his existence had meaning and purpose. But the visions were growing stronger and more disturbing. He saw the mirrors cracking, reality bleeding through from multiple timelines, the careful balance that the ancient people had established beginning to collapse. Each night brought dreams of chaos and confusion, of a world where past and future existed simultaneously, where cause and effect became meaningless, where the very fabric of time began to unravel. Galilahi, the old shaman, confirmed his worst fears during a private consultation in her lodge. She cast the sacred bones and read the patterns with growing concern, then spoke in her own language for several minutes before Ahyoka could translate. She says the sky mirror you came through is still open, still pulling energy from our time into yours. Every day you remain here makes the opening wider, makes it more likely that others will fall through, that the barriers between times will collapse completely. But surely that would take years, Elias protested. Decades, maybe centuries. Ayoka shook her head after another exchange with her grandmother. Time moves differently near the mirrors. What seems like months to you may be only days in your own time, but the damage accumulates faster than normal time. She says we may have only until the spring thaw before the situation becomes too dangerous to repair. Repair how? The answer, when it came, chilled him to the bone. According to the ancient stories, a mirror that had been opened improperly could only be sealed by someone passing back through it from the inside, essentially closing the door behind them. But the passage was dangerous even under the best circumstances, and attempting it with an already unstable mirror could easily result in the traveller being lost forever in the spaces between times. There is another way, Galilahi said through Ahyoka. The old stories speak of a second mirror, hidden in the sacred cave where the first people performed the ceremonies that shaped the world. If you could reach it, you could use it to return to your own time while simultaneously drawing the power from the broken mirror, sealing both passages. Where is this sacred cave? The answer was not encouraging. The site was 3 days' journey to the north, through territory controlled by tribes that were not always friendly to Ayoka's people. Worse, the cave was said to be protected by spirits that did not welcome visitors, and the mirror inside it was supposed to be even more dangerous than the one Elias had found. A master mirror that connected to all the others, capable of opening passages to any time, anywhere. But as winter began to give way to spring, the signs of temporal disturbance became impossible to ignore. Animals began behaving strangely, appearing in the wrong seasons, sometimes aging rapidly or reverting to juvenile forms overnight. Plants bloomed and died in chaotic cycles that followed no natural pattern. Worst of all, some of the villagers began experiencing what they called time dreams, visions of possible futures that were so vivid they seemed more real than waking life. Elias knew he could delay no longer. Much as he had come to love this place and these people, his presence was endangering them. He would have to attempt the journey to the sacred cave, try to find the second mirror, and hope that the ancient stories contained enough truth to guide him home. The night before his departure, the village held a ceremony unlike any he had witnessed. It began at sunset with the lighting of sacred fires and the burning of herbs that filled the air with smoke that seemed to carry prayers and blessings skyward. The entire community gathered in the central plaza, their faces painted with symbols that told the story of his time among them, their voices raised in songs that seemed to weave his spirit into the fabric of their collective memory. Galilei presented him with a medicine bundle containing herbs and objects that she said would protect him on his journey and help him navigate the spiritual dangers he would face. Adai gave him a bow of his own making, along with arrows fletched with eagle feathers and tipped with obsidian points that had been blessed in ceremony. Other members of the community offered gifts both practical and spiritual, food for the journey, clothing suited to travel, ornaments and talismans that carried the power of their prayers. But it was Ayoka's gift that moved him most deeply. She approached him as the ceremony was ending, carrying something wrapped in soft deerskin. When she unwrapped it, he saw that it was a mirror, not obsidian like the one that had brought him here, but polished copper that reflected the firelight like liquid gold. "It was my mother's," she said quietly, "and her mother's before her. It is said to show not what is, but what may be. Keep it with you, and when you return to your own time, look into it and remember us." "I don't want to leave," he said, the words torn from him despite his resolution. "This is the first place I've ever felt like I belonged. You're the first person who's ever understood me." Ayoka smiled, but he could see tears in her eyes. "The Sky Spirit sent you to us for a purpose, but not to stay. You must return and use what you have learned here to help prepare for the time of great change. When our descendants face the troubles you have seen in your visions, they will need someone who understands both worlds, someone who can build bridges between the old wisdom and the new knowledge. But how will I find you again? How will I know if what we've shared is real or just a dream?" Instead of answering directly, Ahyoka began to sing, a song he'd heard before but never understood, a melody that seemed to capture all the beauty and sadness of their impossible love. As she sang, she took a pendant from around her neck. a small carved figure of a bird in flight, and placed it in his hands. "The wind remembers all songs," she said when the melody ended, "and the earth remembers all who have walked upon it. When the time comes, you will know." The journey to the sacred cave began before dawn, with Elias accompanied by 2 young warriors who knew the territory and could help him navigate both the physical and spiritual dangers ahead. They travelled light and fast, following game trails and waterways that avoided the main paths used by larger groups. The landscape they crossed was breathtaking in its pristine beauty. Rolling hills covered with forests that stretched unbroken to the horizon, rivers that ran crystal clear and teemed with fish, meadows where wildflowers bloomed in incredible profusion. But Elias found it difficult to appreciate the scenery, knowing that he was seeing it for what might be the last time, that his journey was taking him away from everything he had come to love. His companions were skilled woodsmen, but also spiritual practitioners who understood the sacred nature of their mission. They moved with constant awareness of the spirits that inhabited every tree and stone, stopping frequently to offer tobacco and prayers, reading signs in the flight of birds and the behaviour of animals that told them which paths were safe and which should be avoided. On the second day, they encountered the first real danger. A band of warriors from a rival tribe had been tracking them since dawn, moving parallel to their path but staying just out of sight. Elias's companions recognised the signs: broken twigs arranged in patterns that couldn't be natural, the sudden silence of birds in certain areas, the faint smell of wood smoke from fires that were quickly extinguished. "They want to know why we travel toward the sacred places," one of his guides explained in whispered English he had learned from traders. "Our tribes have old disputes about territory and hunting rights. They may try to stop us, or they may demand tribute." The confrontation came at midday as they approached a narrow valley that offered the only practical route through a range of rocky hills. The rival warriors emerged from concealment with the fluid grace of men who had perfected the art of woodland warfare, surrounding Elias and his companions with a precision that spoke of careful planning and long experience. Their leader was a man of perhaps 30 years, his face marked with scars that told of many battles, his body decorated with paint and ornaments that proclaimed his status as a war chief. He spoke in a dialect that Elias couldn't understand, but his tone made his meaning clear. They were trespassers in his territory, and they would not be allowed to pass without explanation. What followed was a complex negotiation that revealed the sophisticated diplomacy that existed between the various tribes. Elias's guides identified themselves by clan and family, established their right to travel through the region by citing ancient agreements and mutual obligations, and finally explained the spiritual nature of their mission. The war chief listened with the attention of someone accustomed to weighing the truth and importance of what he heard, asking questions that demonstrated his own deep knowledge of tribal customs and sacred traditions. When the discussion turned to Elias himself, the atmosphere changed dramatically. His pale skin and strange appearance had already marked him as unusual, but when his guides explained that he was a skywalker who had come through these spirit mirrors, the rival warriors reacted with mixtures of awe, fear, and suspicion. Some wanted to kill him immediately, believing that his presence would bring bad luck to their people. Others argued that he should be captured and brought to their own shamans for questioning. But their leader surprised everyone by approaching Elias directly and speaking to him in heavily accented but understandable English. "You're the one the dream speakers have seen," he said, his eyes never leaving Elias's face. "The pale ghost who walks between the times, bringing visions of sorrow and change." "I don't want to bring sorrow," Elias replied carefully. "I only want to return to my own time and seal the pathway that brought me here." The war chief studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The old grandmother of the western village sent word that one like you would come, seeking the great mirror in the cave of first ceremonies. She said we should let you pass, but also that we should warn you. The spirits that guard that place do not welcome strangers, even those who come on sacred business." "What kind of spirits?" "The kind that remember the time before the world was shaped as it is now," the war chief replied. "The kind that see all times at once and judge whether those who approach them are worthy of the knowledge they seek. Many have entered that cave. Few have emerged unchanged. Some have not emerged at all." Despite this warning, or perhaps because of it, the war chief allowed them to continue their journey. But he assigned 2 of his own warriors to accompany them, men who knew the specific dangers of the region and could provide additional protection if needed. The group that continued toward the sacred cave was now 5 strong, representing an alliance between tribes that might normally have been enemies, united by their recognition that Elias's mission transcended ordinary tribal politics. The landscape grew stranger as they approached their destination. Trees began to show signs of the temporal distortion that was spreading outward from the broken mirror, some with leaves that changed colour and fell repeatedly in the span of minutes, others that seemed to age and renew themselves in endless cycles. Streams flowed uphill in some places, and the sun occasionally appeared to move backward across the sky before resuming its normal course. More disturbing were the glimpses of other times that flickered in and out of visibility like heat mirages. Elias caught sight of massive creatures that had been extinct for thousands of years, of landscapes shaped by glaciers that had long since melted, of buildings and people that belonged to futures he couldn't imagine. The barriers between past, present and future were breaking down, and reality itself was beginning to blur. On the morning of the 3rd day, they reached the sacred cave, and Elias understood immediately why this place inspired such awe and fear. The cave mouth was not a simple opening in the hillside, but a complex formation that seemed to have been carved by forces beyond ordinary geology. Symbols were carved into the living rock, not just the petroglyphs he had seen in his own time, but 3-dimensional sculptures that seemed to move and change as he watched them, telling stories that unfolded in ways that challenged his understanding of cause and effect. The air around the cave shimmered with energy that made his skin tingle and his vision blur. Sounds echoed strangely here. His companions' voices seemed to come from multiple directions at once, and their words carried harmonics and overtones that suggested meanings beyond the literal. Even the sunlight behaved differently, bending in ways that created rainbows where none should exist, casting shadows that moved independently of the objects that supposedly created them. His guide stopped at a respectful distance from the cave entrance and began preparations for a ceremony that would, they hoped, gain them permission to enter. They built a small fire using wood they had carried specifically for this purpose, burned sacred herbs that filled the air with smoke that seemed to carry their prayers directly to the spirits, and sang songs so old that their original meanings had been forgotten, preserved only because of their power to open communication with the guardians of this place. As the ceremony progressed, Elias began to hear other voices joining the songs. Not human voices, but sounds that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the air, from the space between moments. The symbols carved into the cave entrance began to glow with their own light, and the shimmering in the air intensified until it became almost solid, like looking through water. Then, without warning, the voices fell silent, and the glow faded. In the sudden stillness, a figure emerged from the cave, not walking out in any normal sense, but materializing from the shadows as if the darkness itself had taken human form. It was an old woman, ancient beyond measure, her hair white as fresh snow and her skin marked with tattoos that seemed to tell the entire history of her people. She wore robes that appeared to be made of starlight and shadow, decorated with ornaments that defied identification. Some seemed to be made of crystallized time, others of solidified music, still others of materials that had no names in any language Elias knew. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of mountains and the patience of geological ages. She addressed each member of their group in turn, speaking to them in their own languages, calling them by names that included not just what they were called by others, but what they called themselves in the deepest privacy of their hearts. To Elias, she spoke in English that was more perfect than any he had ever heard, as if she had learned the language from its own dreams rather than from human teachers. So, Skywalker, you come seeking passage home, but tell me, what is home to one who has walked between the times? Is it the place where your body was born, or the place where your spirit has learned to sing? The question cut deeper than any blade. Elias looked back at his companions, thought of the village he had left behind, of Ayoka, and the life he could have had if he had chosen to stay. Then he thought of the growing instability, the visions of chaos and collapse, the knowledge that his presence was endangering the very people he had come to love. Home is where I can do the most good, he said finally, where I can use what I've learned to help build bridges between your world and mine. The ancient woman nodded as if his answer satisfied some test he hadn't known he was taking. Wisdom grows in unexpected soil, she said. Very well, you may enter the cave, approach the great mirror, Attempt the passage back to your own time, but know this: the mirror will demand a price for its use. It may ask for memories, for years of your life, for abilities you value, for connections that bind you to joy. Are you prepared to pay whatever it asks? I am. And if the price it demands is the knowledge you have gained here, if returning to your own time means forgetting everything you have learned, everyone you have loved, will you still choose to go? The question struck him like a physical blow. To return to his own time but lose all memory of this experience, to forget Ayoka and Galilahi and Adai and all the others who had become more family to him than his own blood relatives had ever been, it seemed a price too high to pay. But then he thought of the visions, of the time of great dying that was coming, of the need for someone who could stand between two worlds and help them understand each other. Even if he forgot the details, perhaps some deeper knowledge would remain, some instinctive understanding that would guide him when the time came. Yes, he said, though the word tore at his heart. I'll pay whatever price is asked. The ancient woman smiled, and for a moment she looked like a young girl filled with joy and mischief. That is why you will not have to, she said. The mirror demands sacrifice from those who seek power or knowledge for selfish purposes, but you seek to sacrifice yourself for others. The spirits recognize this, and they will be generous. She turned and walked back toward the cave, gesturing for him to follow. At the entrance she paused and spoke to his companions in their own languages, blessing them and charging them with carrying word of what they had witnessed back to their people. Then she led Elias into the darkness. The cave was vast beyond imagining, its walls and ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to extend into infinity. The floor was carved with symbols and patterns that told the history of the world from its creation to its final ending, and walking across them felt like travelling through time itself. Elias saw the birth of the first people, their expansion across the continent, their development of the technologies and spiritual practices that had allowed them to live in harmony with their environment for thousands of years. But he also saw what was coming: the arrival of European diseases, the wars of conquest, the systematic destruction of everything these people had built. He saw his own descendants playing roles both heroic and villainous in the great tragedy that would unfold over the next centuries, and he understood with crystal clarity why he had been brought here, what knowledge he was meant to carry back to his own time. At the centre of the cave, set into a raised platform carved from a single piece of black stone, was the master mirror. It was larger than the one he had found in his own time, perfectly circular and perhaps 6 feet in diameter, its obsidian surface so flawless that it seemed to be a window into the void itself. Around its edge were carved symbols that seemed to move and shift as he watched them, telling stories in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. This is the first mirror, the ancient woman explained, created by the star people before they returned to the sky, left as a gift and a responsibility for those who would come after. It connects to all the other mirrors, in all the other times. Through it, you can travel not just to your own time, but to any time, any place where the other mirrors wait. Elias approached the mirror slowly, feeling the power that radiated from its surface like heat from a fire. As he drew closer, images began to appear in its depths, not reflections of the cave around him, but visions of other places, other times. He saw the cave in his own era, overgrown and forgotten, the smaller mirror cracked and leaking temporal energy. He saw possible futures where that energy continued to grow and spread, creating paradoxes that would eventually unravel the entire timeline. But he also saw other possibilities, futures where he returned to his own time with the knowledge he had gained, where he used that knowledge to help preserve native cultures and wisdom, where he served as a bridge between the worlds of scientific rationality and spiritual understanding. In some of those futures, the coming tragedy was mitigated, if not prevented entirely. In others, enough was preserved that the healing could begin sooner and more completely. The choice is yours, the ancient woman said. You can return to your own time, seal the broken mirror and work to prepare your people for the changes that are coming. Or you can step through to any other time, any other place where your presence might make a difference. The mirror will take you wherever your heart truly wishes to go. Elias stared into the swirling depths of the obsidian surface, seeing 1,000 possible lives, 1,000 different ways his story might unfold. For a moment he was tempted to choose a different time entirely, perhaps the distant future, when the wounds between cultures had healed and he could live in a world that had learned to integrate the best of both traditions, or perhaps the distant past when he could warn the First Peoples about what was coming and help them prepare more effectively. But as he considered these possibilities, he kept coming back to the same conclusion. His own time, for all its flaws and limitations, was where he belonged. It was where his presence could make the most difference, where his unique knowledge and experience could serve the greatest good. And deep in his heart, he knew that Iyoka was right. He had been sent to this time and place not to stay, but to learn and then return. He reached out and touched the mirror's surface, feeling it ripple like water under his fingers. The ancient woman began to sing, her voice joined by others that seemed to come from the mirror itself, from the walls of the cave, from the very stones beneath his feet. The symbols around the mirror's edge began to glow and move faster, and Elias felt the familiar sensation of falling that had brought him here in the first place. But this time was different. Instead of the chaotic tumbling he had experienced before, he felt himself being carefully guided, protected by forces he couldn't see but could sense all around him. The ancient woman's song followed him as he fell through layers of time, and in her voice he heard promises that what he had learned would not be forgotten, that the love he had found would not be lost, that his sacrifice would bear fruit in ways he couldn't imagine. The last thing he saw before the vision faded was Ahyoka's face, smiling at him across the centuries, her lips forming the words of the song that would connect them across time and space. The wind remembers all songs, and the earth remembers all who have walked upon it. Then he was back in his own cave, in his own time, gasping and shaking as if he had been holding his breath for months instead of moments. The smaller obsidian mirror was still embedded in the wall before him, but even as he watched, cracks began to spread across its surface. Light leaked from the cracks, not the harsh light of his torch, but the soft golden light of another time, another place. He understood instinctively what he needed to do. Drawing on knowledge he couldn't quite remember learning, he began to sing. Not the song Ahyoka had taught him, for that had faded like a dream upon waking, but something deeper, older, a melody that seemed to come from the earth itself. As he sang, he pressed his hands against the cracked mirror, feeling the temporal energy that still flowed through it. The process was exhausting, requiring him to maintain perfect concentration while forces beyond his comprehension flowed through his body and mind. But gradually the cracks in the mirror began to close, the leaking light faded, and the sense of connection to that other time grew weaker and more distant. When the last crack sealed itself, the mirror went dark and cold, just another piece of worked obsidian embedded in a cave wall. Elias collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by exhaustion and a sense of loss so profound it felt like dying. The detailed memories of his time in the past were already fading, becoming vague and dreamlike, but the emotional impact remained. The knowledge that he had experienced something extraordinary, had been part of something larger than himself, had loved and been loved in ways that transcended ordinary human experience. When he finally made his way out of the cave, he found the thunderstorm had passed, and the morning sun was painting the Virginia hills with gold and green. But everything looked different now, not the pristine wilderness he had briefly known, but a landscape already marked by European settlement, already diminished from what it had once been. His uncle Jeremiah was waiting for him at the farm, drunk and angry about his absence. "Where the hell have you been, boy?" "Been gone all night, worried me sick. Probably off in the woods playing Indian again, weren't you?" Elias looked at his uncle with new eyes, seeing not just the crude brutality that had always defined their relationship, but the fear and pain that drove it. This was a man who had lost his own dreams, who had settled for less than he wanted and blamed the world for his failures. Understanding didn't make the abuse acceptable, but it made it comprehensible in ways that changed everything. "I was exploring the cave system up in Raven's Hollow," Leia said calmly. "I think I may have found something significant. Petroglyphs, maybe some artifacts. I'd like to document them properly." Something in his tone, some new authority in his voice, made Jeremiah back down from the confrontation he'd been prepared to start. Instead, he grumbled about damn fool boy and waste of time, but he didn't raise his hand or his voice the way he usually did. Over the following days and weeks, Elias threw himself into documenting everything he could remember about his experience. The specific details continued to fade, but the broader knowledge remained, an understanding of Native American culture that went far beyond anything in the books available to him, an intuitive grasp of ecological principles that wouldn't be formally recognised by European science for decades, a spiritual awareness that transformed his relationship with the natural world. He began keeping a journal, filling page after page with observations about plants and animals, sketches of artefacts and symbols, fragments of songs and stories that came to him in dreams. He also began learning everything he could about the native tribes of Virginia, seeking out elderly settlers who had traded with them, reading every account he could find, gradually building a picture of what had been lost and what might still be preserved. But it was when he returned to the cave that he received the confirmation he'd been hoping for, and dreading in equal measure. The obsidian mirror was still there, still dark and sealed, but carved into the stone beside it was a message that hadn't been there before. Namvashias Gaia, the wind remembers you. The words were carved in Cherokee syllabary, a writing system that wouldn't be invented for another decade. But somehow Elias could read them, could hear in them the voice of someone he couldn't quite remember but would never forget. Below the Cherokee words, in English letters that looked as if they had been there for centuries, was a single name, Ayoka. As the months passed, Elias began to understand the true scope of what he had been given. His experience had left him with not just knowledge but a calling, a deep understanding that his life's work must be to serve as a bridge between cultures, to preserve what could be preserved and heal what could be healed. He left his uncle's farm as soon as he came of age, making his way to the nearest city with libraries and schools. Using his father's surveying instruments and his own mysterious knowledge of the land, he found work as a guide and surveyor, slowly building a reputation as someone who understood the wilderness better than men twice his age. But his real passion was for writing and research. He began collecting stories from the last generation of settlers who had direct contact with native peoples, recording their accounts with an accuracy and sensitivity that impressed even skeptical scholars. He learned Cherokee, Creek, and several other southeastern languages, often finding that words and phrases came to him without conscious learning, as if they were memories rather than acquired knowledge. His first book, Voices from the Vanished Land, True Accounts of Native Life in the Virginia Mountains, was published when he was 25 and caused a sensation in academic circles. Unlike other contemporary works that portrayed Native Americans as either noble savages or dangerous primitives, Elias's book presented them as complex human beings with sophisticated cultures, practical wisdom, and spiritual insights that the dominant society desperately needed. More books followed, each one adding to his reputation as the foremost authority on Native American culture in the Southeast. But Elias was careful never to claim credit for insights that weren't his own, always acknowledging that his understanding came from sources he couldn't fully explain, from dreams and visions that felt more like memories than her imagination. He never married, though he had opportunities. Something in him remained forever connected to a love he couldn't quite remember, a relationship that had been perfect in its brevity and impossible in its fulfillment. Instead, he devoted himself entirely to his work, to the mission that had been given to him in ways he was beginning to forget but would never truly lose. As he grew older, his writings became more explicitly focused on preservation and reconciliation. He established schools that taught both European and native ways of understanding the world, founded libraries that collected and preserved oral traditions, and worked tirelessly to document languages and cultures that were disappearing with each passing year. He also became known as a healer, though he never claimed medical training. People came to him with ailments that conventional doctors couldn't cure, and often went away healthier after treatments that combined herbal medicine with something that could only be called spiritual healing. When asked where he had learned such techniques, he would only say that they had come to him in dreams. But perhaps his most important work was less visible: the quiet conversations with government officials about treaty negotiations, the letters to influential people advocating for native rights, the behind-the-scenes efforts to prevent some of the worst excesses of American expansion. He couldn't stop the great dying that he had seen in his visions, but he could mitigate it, could help preserve seeds of knowledge and culture that would grow again when the time was right. In his 60th year, as he sat in his study surrounded by the books and artifacts that represented a lifetime of dedication, Elias received a visitor that changed everything. She was a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17, with the bearing and features that immediately marked her as Native American despite her European-style dress. She approached his house at sunset, walking with a confidence that suggested she belonged wherever she chose to be. When he opened the door to her knock, she spoke a single word in a language he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 40 years, but recognized instantly: grandfather. The word was Cherokee, but it carried layers of meaning that went beyond simple kinship. It was a term of respect for an elder, recognition of spiritual relationship, acknowledgement of someone who had earned the right to be called ancestor, even while still living. "I have been sent to find you," she continued in English that carried the same musical quality he remembered from another voice, in another time. "My grandmother's grandmother left stories about you, about the pale man who lived among the people in the time before the great changes, who learned our ways and then returned to his own people to plant seeds of understanding." Elias stared at her, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "What was your grandmother's name?" The young woman smiled, and for a moment he saw another face, another smile shining through the years like sunlight through water. "Her name was Ahyoka," she said. "She lived to be very old, and she told stories of the Skywalker who came through the spirit mirrors, who learned to sing with the wind and speak with the earth. She said that someday, when the wheel of time turned full circle, someone would come to find him and bring him a message." She reached into a pouch at her side and drew out something that made Elias's breath catch in his throat. It was a pendant, a small carved bird in flight, worn smooth by age and handling, but unmistakably the same one that a Cherokee girl had placed in his hands beside a sacred fire in another century. "She said to tell you that the wind has remembered your song," the young woman continued, "that the earth has remembered your footsteps, that the seeds you planted have grown into trees that will shelter many people in the storms that are coming." Elias took the pendant with shaking hands, feeling the smooth stone warm against his palm as if it had been waiting all these years to return to him. As he held it, memories flooded back, not the detailed recollections he had lost upon his return, but something deeper and more permanent. The sound of Ahyoka's laughter, the feeling of belonging to something larger than himself, the knowledge that love could transcend time and space and death itself. "She also said," the young woman continued, "that when the time of great healing begins, you will remember everything, that the spirits have kept your memories safe, waiting for the moment when they would be needed again." That night Elias sat by his fire holding the pendant and feeling the years fall away like leaves in autumn. The young woman, who had given her name as Atsila, meaning fire, had stayed for dinner and told him stories that filled in gaps in his understanding, that connected dots he hadn't even realized were scattered across his life. Ahyoka had lived to be 93, dying peacefully in her sleep in a cabin deep in the Tennessee mountains, where her people had taken refuge after the Cherokee removal. She had never married, dedicating her life to preserving the old ways and preparing for the time when they would be needed again. She had become a renowned medicine woman and storyteller, and her tales of the Skywalker had become part of the oral tradition of several southeastern tribes. "She said you would know her again," Atsila told him as she prepared to leave the next morning. "She said that souls who find each other across time and space are never truly separated, that the spirits weave them together in ways that transcend single lifetimes." "Will I see her again?" Elias asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Atsila smiled. "She said to tell you that the great circle is completing itself, that the time of ending is also the time of beginning. She said you would understand when the moment comes." After she left, Elias found that his dreams had changed. Instead of the vague, emotional impressions that had haunted his sleep for decades, he began to have vivid, detailed visions of the life he'd lived in that other time. He remembered the village with perfect clarity, could recall conversations word for word, could feel again the sense of belonging and purpose that had defined those magical months. But more than memories were returning. The spiritual abilities he had begun to develop during his time with Ahyoka's people were reasserting themselves, stronger now and refined by decades of unconscious practice. He found that he could communicate with animals, could sense the health of plants and trees, could feel the emotional states of people around him with increasing clarity. Most remarkably, he began to receive visits from what he could only describe as spirits. Not ghosts in any conventional sense, but presences that seemed to exist partially in his time and partially in others. Sometimes they were people he had known in that other life, coming to give him messages or guidance. Sometimes they were strangers who sought his help in matters that spanned multiple generations, and sometimes, just sometimes, he caught glimpses of Ahyoka herself, not as the girl he had known, but as the elder she had become. still beautiful but marked by age and wisdom and the sorrows she had witnessed. She never spoke during these visitations, but her presence filled him with a peace and joy that sustained him through the increasingly difficult work of his final years. For the world was changing rapidly, and not always in directions that gave him hope. The Civil War came and went, leaving scars that would take generations to heal. The Western expansion accelerated, bringing with it the final destruction of the great buffalo herds and the last free tribes. Industry began to transform the landscape in ways that would have been unimaginable when he was young, and the gap between human civilization and the natural world grew wider with each passing year. But there were signs of hope as well. Some of the seeds he'd planted were beginning to sprout. A new generation of scholars was taking Native American culture seriously, approaching it with respect rather than condescension. Conservation movements were beginning to recognize the wisdom embedded in traditional ecological practices, and here and there bridges were being built between communities that had been enemies for generations. In his 72nd year, as winter settled over the Virginia mountains where he had built his final home, Elias felt the approach of what he knew would be his last great transition. His health was failing, his body worn out by decades of travel and research and the peculiar stresses that came with existing partially in multiple times. But he was not afraid. The visions that came to him now were of reunions rather than endings, of the completion of patterns that had been decades in the weaving. He saw a yoka waiting for him in a place that existed outside of time, young and beautiful as she had been when they first met, but also wise with all the experience of her long life. On the night he died, the aurora borealis appeared over Virginia, an event so rare that it was recorded in newspapers across the region. Those who saw it reported that the light seemed to dance and spiral in patterns that reminded them of smoke from sacred fires, and that the wind that night carried sounds like distant singing, like voices calling across impossible distances. The young Cherokee woman, Atsila, was with him at the end. She had appeared at his door 3 days earlier, saying simply that she had been called to come. She sat beside his bed through the final night, holding his hand and singing songs in her own language that seemed to ease his passage from this world to whatever lay beyond. "Can you see her?" she asked softly as his breathing grew shallow and irregular. Elias smiled, his eyes focused on something she couldn't see. "She's here," he whispered. "She's been waiting. She says the great circle is complete. The wind remembers. The earth remembers." His last words were in Cherokee, spoken with perfect pronunciation despite the decades that had passed since he had heard the language spoken. "Nvishiaskaya usti. The wind carries us home." When Atsila went through his papers after the funeral, she found a manuscript he had been working on in his final months, a complete account of his journey through time, written with such detail and precision that it read like a memoir rather than a work of fiction. Attached to it was a note in his handwriting: "For those who will come after, when the time is right for the full truth to be told." She also found the obsidian mirror pendant, the one Ahyoka had sent through the generations with its message of remembrance and hope. But when she touched it, the stone was warm, and for just a moment she heard voices, 2 voices, singing together in harmony that transcended time and space and death itself. The manuscript was eventually published, though not for many years. When it finally appeared, readers weren't sure whether to classify it as historical fiction or spiritual memoir. But among Native American communities, it was recognized immediately for what it was: a true account of one man's journey across time and cultures, a bridge built between worlds that had been kept apart for too long, and in the archives of several universities, filed away with other documents deemed too fragile or too strange for general access, were Elias Rowe's field notes and recordings, thousands of pages of Cherokee songs and stories, Creek medicinal formulas, Seminole agricultural techniques, and dozens of other cultural treasures that had been preserved against the day when they would be needed again. The Great Circle had indeed completed itself. The young man who had fallen through time in search of something he couldn't name had become the elder who built bridges across centuries, who preserved knowledge that would have otherwise been lost, who proved that love and understanding could transcend any barrier that history and hatred might erect. And somewhere in the space between times, in the realm where all moments exist simultaneously, 2 voices continue to sing together: the Cherokee girl who believed in spirits and prophecy, and the young surveyor who learned that the greatest adventures are not those that take us away from home, but those that teach us what home really means,